The council spoke too late. Humanity was already gone. The ships arrived at Earth after traveling for 3 months through the dark space between stars, and Ambassador Vexithera stood at the observation window, watching the blue planet grow larger with each passing moment. Her 4 arms crossed in a gesture that meant curiosity among her kind, and she wondered what kind of reception the humans would give them after 847 years of silence. Because the council had finally decided to answer their call, finally agreed to send a delegation, finally stopped debating and started acting. Though perhaps they should have moved faster, she thought. But bureaucracy moved slowly when 12 different species had to agree on everything, and now they were here to make things right, to offer humanity the friendship they had requested so long ago, to welcome them into the galactic community at last. The fleet consisted of 17 vessels, each representing a different member species of the Galactic Council, and they carried diplomats, scientists, cultural experts, and trade negotiators, all prepared to begin the long process of integrating humanity into the greater civilization that spanned 40,000 worlds. And Vexithera had studied the human broadcasts carefully, learning their languages, understanding their customs, preparing herself for the negotiations that would surely take years, because bringing a new species into the council was never simple. But the humans seemed eager, their messages full of hope and desperation, asking for help with their dying son, begging for the technology to save their world, pleading for a chance to join the stars. The communications officer, a blob-like creature named Zixcor, turned several of his eye stalks toward Vexithera and spoke in the common tongue that all council members used, saying that he was getting no response from Earth, no acknowledgement of their hails, no greeting or challenge or even a simple automated reply. And this seemed strange because the human broadcasts had been so frequent, so insistent, so desperate for contact, yet now there was only silence, a vast and empty silence that filled the space where voices should have been. And Vexithera felt the first stirring of unease in her primary stomach, the one she used for digesting thoughts rather than food. They entered orbit around Earth, and the scanners began their work, sweeping across the surface of the planet, searching for the massive cities that the broadcasts had shown, looking for the billions of humans that should be there, hunting for any sign of the civilization that had built radio telescopes and sent messages into space, and begged the council for help. But the readings made no sense because the cities were there, standing tall and intact but empty, completely and utterly empty, without a single human life sign anywhere on the surface, and the forests had grown into the streets, vines climbing up buildings, trees pushing through abandoned vehicles, nature reclaiming what humans had built. Vexithera ordered landing parties to 3 locations, the largest human cities according to their records, places called New York and Tokyo and London, and she went down herself to the place humans had called their United Nations building, where they had recorded many of their broadcasts to the stars, where they had debated and decided to reach out to whatever intelligence might be listening, and the building stood pristine, maintained by robots that still cleaned the floors and watered the plants, machines that continued their programmed tasks despite the absence of any humans to appreciate their work. And in the main assembly hall, a holographic display played on repeat, showing the same message over and over, a loop that had been running for centuries. The hologram showed a man in formal clothing, his hair gray, his eyes tired but determined, and he identified himself as Dr. Kelvin Ross, director of the International Space Authority, and he spoke directly to the camera, directly to whoever might one day arrive, saying that humanity had asked for help, had sent their messages into the void, had waited and hoped and prayed for an answer. But the council had debated, had formed committees, had discussed the matter for 8 centuries while Earth's sun grew hotter, and the surface became harder to survive on. And humanity had realized that no help was coming, that they were alone, that they would have to save themselves or die waiting for aliens who would never arrive in time. The message continued, and Ross explained that humanity had solved their own problem, had found their own way to survive, had discovered something the council had never imagined possible, and they were leaving, all of them, every last human, abandoning Earth but taking their knowledge with them, going somewhere the council would never find them, somewhere they could build a future without waiting for permission. And he thanked the council for teaching humanity an important lesson, that waiting for others to save you was the same as giving up, that hope without action was just another word for surrender, and humans had never been good at surrendering. The hologram flickered and Ross leaned forward, his final words spoken slowly and clearly, saying that the council should not look for them, should not waste their time searching, because humanity was already gone, had been gone for centuries, had left behind only empty cities and automated systems and this one message, and he hoped that someday the council might learn to move faster, to help those who asked before it was too late, to remember that while they debated entire civilizations could rise and fall, could live and die, could lose all hope and find new paths. And with those words, the hologram ended and began again from the beginning, an endless loop of humanity's farewell. Vexithera stood frozen, her forearms hanging limp at her sides, and she tried to process what she had heard, tried to understand how an entire species could simply vanish, could leave their home world and disappear so completely that not even the Council's best sensors could find a trace. And she thought about the 847 years of debate, the countless committees, the votes and revotes and endless discussion about whether humanity was ready, whether they could be trusted, whether their violent history made them too dangerous to join the Council. And all that time the humans had been waiting, hoping, eyeing. The other landing parties reported similar findings: empty cities on the Moon, abandoned colonies on Mars, silent stations orbiting Jupiter and Saturn, every human settlement vacated and left behind, and the robots maintained everything, keeping the buildings clean, the gardens watered, the systems running, as if their creators might return at any moment, but the humans were gone, had been gone for so long that Earth had started to heal, forests expanding, animals returning to cities, the planet slowly forgetting that humans had ever lived there, and Zixcore analyzed the databases, finding that every piece of advanced human technology had been erased, every schematic deleted, every blueprint destroyed, leaving behind only basic information, only simple things, only enough to show that humans had existed, but not enough to explain how they had escaped. Vexithera returned to her ship and called an emergency meeting of all the ambassadors, and they gathered in the conference chamber. 12 different species trying to comprehend the impossible, trying to understand how they had failed so completely, how they had let an entire civilization slip through their grasp. And the question that haunted all of them was simple and terrible. Where had humanity gone, and more importantly, what had they become in the centuries since they left? And would they ever forgive the Council for arriving 800 years too late? The Council spoke too late. Humanity was already gone. Peter Kane had spent 300 years studying dead civilizations, digging through ruins, piecing together the fragments of species that had risen and fallen across the galaxy, and he thought he had seen everything, every possible way a civilization could end. But standing in the empty quantum research facility on Earth, staring at a single equation written on a whiteboard, he realized he had never seen anything like this, because civilizations did not simply leave, did not pack up everything and everyone and disappear into nothing. Yet that was exactly what humanity had done, and the equation on the board might explain how. The whiteboard had been protected by a stasis field, preserved perfectly for 8 centuries, and the equation was complex, filled with symbols that represented dimensional mathematics, quantum topology, spatial folding theories that the Council had studied for 50,000 years, without ever making practical. And yet here it was, written in chalk by someone named Dr. Natalie Brooks according to the signature at the bottom. An equation that described something the Council considered impossible. A way to fold space not just locally but dimensionally, to step outside the universe itself and into somewhere else, somewhere beyond. Kane copied the equation carefully, sent it to the Council's top physicists and waited while they analyzed it. And 3 days later they confirmed what he suspected, that the equation was real, that it worked in theory, that with enough energy and computing power it could actually open a doorway to another dimension, another reality, another place entirely separate from the universe they all knew. But the energy requirements were staggering, the computational complexity beyond anything the Council could manage, requiring technology they would not develop for thousands of years. Yet humanity had somehow done it 800 years ago. The investigation team spread out across human space, visiting every abandoned outpost, every empty colony, every silent station, and at each location they found more clues, more pieces of the puzzle, more evidence that humanity had not just fled, but had executed a planned evacuation of their entire species. And on Proxima Centauri b, they found a settlement that had housed 400,000 humans. A thriving colony with farms and factories and schools, all abandoned in less than 6 hours according to the automated logs, and the speed of the evacuation suggested they had known exactly what they were doing, had practiced it, had prepared for this moment. In the colony's central square, they found another message. This one recorded by Captain Gregory Stone, a military officer whose service record showed he had commanded the defense fleet, and in the recording he stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in determination, and he spoke with barely controlled anger, saying that humanity had applied for council membership 400 years earlier, had filled out every form, had provided every piece of requested information, had opened their borders to council inspectors, had done everything asked of them, and the council had responded by forming a subcommittee to study the application, which formed another subcommittee, which requested more information, which debated for 2 centuries before voting to delay the decision for another 200 years. Stone continued, his voice growing harder, explaining that humanity did not have 200 years, that their sun was dying faster than expected, that they needed help immediately, needed the council's star-lifting technology, needed the expertise of species who had solved these problems millennia ago. But the council moved at the speed of bureaucracy, at the pace of endless debate, at the rhythm of committees discussing committees, and while they talked, humans died. Their world grew hotter, their future grew darker, and they realized that the council would never help them in time, would never move fast enough, would never care enough about one small species to actually do something. The recording showed Stone turning to point at something off camera, and the view shifted to show a massive ship, sleek and strange, built with technology that looked nothing like council designs, and Stone said that humanity had stopped waiting, had stopped begging, had stopped hoping for the council to save them, and instead they had saved themselves, had built something new, had discovered something the council never imagined, and they were going somewhere better, somewhere they could actually build a future, somewhere far beyond the reach of aliens who thought debate was more important than action. Sixth Corps found restricted files in the council's own databases, files that had been sealed for security reasons, files that required special clearance to access. And when he finally broke through the encryption, he discovered the truth that the council had hidden, that humanity's first contact request had been denied, not because they were not ready, but because they were too dangerous, too aggressive, too quick to develop new technologies, and the vote had been overwhelming. 8,742 council members voting to quarantine humanity in their home system, to prevent them from spreading into the galaxy, to contain them until they became more peaceful, more controllable, more like the other species. The files showed centuries of surveillance, council ships watching Earth from a distance, monitoring human transmissions, studying their development, and the reports all said the same thing, that humans advanced too quickly, that they went from primitive radio to quantum computers in less than 2 centuries, that they developed fusion power and genetic engineering and artificial intelligence at a pace that frightened the council, and the decision was made to keep them isolated, to let them develop alone, to wait until they either destroyed themselves or became civilized enough to join. But the council had not expected humans to break the quarantine, had not imagined they could develop faster than light travel on their own, had never considered that isolation might make them stronger instead of weaker. Kane discovered something extraordinary in the Saturn research stations, hidden in a file labeled as equipment maintenance logs, buried so deep in boring technical data that no one had bothered to read it in centuries, and inside he found proof that humanity had cracked faster than light travel, 300 years before the council even suspected, that they had tested it secretly, had built ships in the outer solar system where council sensors could not detect them, had pretended to still be struggling with basic spaceflight, while actually preparing to leave, and the deception had been perfect, complete, sustained for generations. The research stations contained laboratories that were centuries ahead of anything humanity had shown publicly. Quantum computers that rivaled council technology, energy systems that used principles the council had not yet discovered, medical equipment that could cure diseases the council still struggled with, and all of it had been developed in secret, hidden from the watchers, built by a species that knew they were being observed and decided to use that surveillance against their observers. And Kane realized with growing horror that humanity had not just escaped, they had fooled the entire council, had made them believe humans were primitive and struggling, while actually preparing the greatest exodus in galactic history. The Ghost Fleet was found drifting in deep space, thousands of ships arranged in perfect formation, each one stripped of its essential systems, empty hulls floating in the void, and the examination showed they were transport vessels, colony ships, massive carriers designed to move millions of people, and they had all been used once, had all made one final journey, had all delivered their passengers to some unknown destination before being abandoned here, and the drives had been removed, the navigation computers wiped, every piece of technology that might explain where they had gone carefully extracted and taken away. Kane stood on the bridge of one abandoned ship, a vessel that had once carried 50,000 humans, and he imagined them here, families packed together, children sleeping in stasis pods, adults watching through windows as Earth shrank behind them, and he wondered what they had felt, leaving their home forever, trusting in technology they had built themselves, believing in a future they could not see, and he realized that humanity had not been desperate or afraid. They had been determined, united, absolutely certain that they would survive, and that certainty had carried them to wherever they were now, a place the Council could never reach, a destination beyond all searching. The Council spoke too late. Humanity was already gone. Admiral Trevena had commanded fleets for 2 centuries, had fought in 3 wars, had seen worlds burn and civilizations crumble, and she thought nothing could surprise her anymore. But the gravitational readings coming from 17 different sectors made no sense, showed patterns that should not exist, anomalies that suggested massive objects appearing and disappearing, leaving traces in space-time like footprints in sand, and when she sent ships to investigate, they found something that changed everything, found evidence that humanity had not simply left but had built an empire in secret, had constructed cities and stations across dozens of worlds while the Council watched Earth and saw nothing. The dead world of Threshold 9 had never supported life, had been surveyed centuries ago and marked as worthless, a ball of rock with no atmosphere, no resources, no reason for anyone to ever visit it. And yet when the Council ships arrived, they found a city, a massive human city built into canyons and caves, structures that could house 2 million people, factories and farms and schools and hospitals, everything needed for a thriving colony, and according to the automated timestamps, the entire city had been built in 14 months, had gone from empty rock to functioning metropolis in less than 2 years, and then had been abandoned, left behind like all the others. Trevena walked through empty streets, her boots echoing on pavement that had never known weather, and she examined the buildings with a trained eye, noting the construction methods that were unlike anything in Council records, materials that seemed to grow rather than be assembled, structures that looked organic despite being clearly artificial, and her engineers studied the technology with growing alarm, reporting that the construction speed would require fabrication methods the Council could not match, automation systems that were more advanced than anything they had, and energy efficiency that seemed to violate known physics. The city had been planned perfectly, every street optimized for traffic flow, every building positioned to maximize solar exposure, every system integrated with every other system in ways that showed deep understanding of urban design, and Trevena realized this was not humanity's first attempt, that they must have built dozens or hundreds of cities before this one, must have practiced and refined their techniques, must have learned from each iteration, and the speed at which they had progressed was terrifying, because it suggested they had not slowed down, had continued advancing even after they left. Counselor Thelquin was a mathematician, a being of pure logic who saw the universe in equations and probabilities, and he analyzed the human timeline carefully, comparing their rate of technological advancement to every other species in Council records, and the results were unprecedented, because most species took 50,000 years to go from discovering fire to achieving spaceflight, took another 10,000 to develop faster than light travel, took millennia to master each new field of science. But humanity had compressed all of that into less than 10,000 years, had gone from stone tools to dimensional transcendence in a time span that was barely a footnote in galactic history. The comparison charts showed humanity's progress as a nearly vertical line while other species rose in gentle curves, and Thelquin calculated that if humanity had maintained their rate of advancement, if they had continued learning and growing at the same pace, then in the 800 years since they left, they would have surpassed the Council in every field, would have developed technologies that would seem like magic, would have become something beyond anything the galaxy had seen before, and the thought kept him awake through several sleep cycles because he understood what it meant, that somewhere out there, humanity was not struggling to survive but thriving, growing, becoming something terrifying. Engineer Raymond Clark's personal logs were found in a hidden cache on Europa, protected by encryption that took months to break, and inside were detailed records of humanity's unification, the moment when every human nation had set aside their differences, when corporations had shared their research freely, when every scientist on Earth had worked toward the single goal of survival, and Clark had been amazed by it, had written about how humans who had fought wars for thousands of years suddenly cooperated perfectly, how the threat of extinction had forged them into something new, something unified, something stronger than the sum of their parts. The logs showed that humanity had known about the Council's surveillance, had detected the watching ships, had understood they were being studied like laboratory animals, and instead of being angry they had been calculating, had used the surveillance as cover, had shown the Council what they wanted to see while hiding their true progress. And Clark had been part of the deception, had deliberately published research papers with errors, had staged public failures of experiments that had actually succeeded, had made humanity look primitive and struggling, while they were actually racing ahead. Captain Diane Foster's military records painted a picture of someone who had prepared for war, but hoped for peace, who had designed weapons capable of destroying Council ships, who had trained soldiers to fight against superior technology, who had built defensive networks around every human world, and yet had never fired a shot, had never launched an attack, had never given the Council a reason to consider humans a threat. And her final report recommended evacuation over confrontation, recommended escape over engagement, recommended that humanity simply leave rather than fight for a place in a galaxy that did not want them. The weapons humanity had designed were terrifying in their efficiency, showed understanding of Council ship vulnerabilities that should have been secret, exploited weaknesses in Council defenses that had never been tested, and Trevena realized that if humanity had chosen violence, if they had decided to force their way into the Council, they might have succeeded, might have carved out an empire through conquest, but they had chosen differently, had decided that building something new was better than fighting for acceptance from those who would never truly welcome them. The Exodus ships had been found, thousands of them, but their drives were missing, and the engineering team analyzed the mounting points, the power connections, the fuel systems, and realized the drives had been something entirely new, used principles that left no trace, operated on theories the Council had never considered, and when they tried to reconstruct the technology from the remaining clues, they failed completely, could not even begin to understand how the systems might have worked. And this failure was more frightening than anything else because it proved how far ahead humanity had gone. Sixth Corps discovered something disturbing in the economic records, found that 17 Council species had been buying human technology on the black market for centuries, had acquired designs and schematics and blueprints through illegal channels, had reverse-engineered human innovations and claimed them as their own. And the list of technologies was staggering. Medical scanners that saved millions of lives, reactor designs that powered entire worlds, food synthesis methods that ended famines, water purification systems that made dead planets livable, and all of it had come from humanity, had been stolen or bought or copied before the Exodus. The economic analysis showed that removing human-derived technology from the Council would cause immediate collapse, that too many critical systems depended on innovations that humans had created, that the Council had built itself on a foundation of stolen ideas without even realizing it, and the species that had voted to quarantine humanity, that had called them too dangerous to join, that had isolated them for 8 centuries. Those same species now survived because of human genius, because of the very creativity and rapid advancement they had feared. Trevena assembled all the evidence, compiled every report, analyzed every clue, and the conclusion was inescapable, that humanity had not been the primitive species the Council had believed them to be, that they had been advanced enough to escape entirely, that they had possessed technology and knowledge beyond Council understanding, and somewhere in another dimension, beyond the reach of any ship or sensor, 12 billion humans were continuing their journey, continuing their advancement, becoming something the Council could not imagine, and the question that haunted her was simple: what would humanity be like when they came back, if they came back? And would they remember the Council that had abandoned them? The Council spoke too late. Humanity was already gone, Chairwoman. Velmora had led the Galactic Council for 500 years, had guided 12 species through wars and plagues and economic collapses, had made decisions that affected trillions of lives, and she had always believed the council was right, that their slow, careful approach to everything was wisdom rather than weakness, that taking centuries to decide important matters was prudence rather than paralysis. But standing before the emergency assembly, looking at the faces of representatives from 8,000 worlds, she felt doubt for the first time in her long life, felt the weight of a mistake so massive it could not be measured. The evidence was spread before them. Holographic displays showing empty Earth, abandoned colonies, ghost cities on dead worlds, and the equation that Dr. Natalie Brooks had left behind, the equation that council physicists had finally decoded, the equation that proved humanity had achieved something the council considered impossible for at least 10,000 more years, and the assembly sat in stunned silence trying to process what it meant, trying to understand how they had failed so completely, how they had underestimated an entire species so badly. Velamora activated the presentation, showed them the timeline of humanity's contact requests, the 847 years of messages sent into space, the desperate pleas for help with their dying son, the formal application for council membership that had been filed 400 years ago. And then she showed them the council's response, the formation of committees to study the request, the subcommittees to analyze the data, the debates that lasted for decades, the votes that were delayed again and again, and the final decision to quarantine humanity for another 200 years. And the shame in the chamber was thick enough to touch. The physicist Krelva stood to explain the equation, his tentacles gesturing at the complex mathematics floating in the air, and he said that dimensional transcendence required energy output equivalent to a star-going supernova, required computational power that could simulate entire universes, required materials that could withstand forces that would tear apart normal matter, and humanity had somehow achieved all of this, had built reactors that could generate the needed power, had created computers that could handle the calculations, had discovered materials the council had never encountered, and they had done it all in secret, had hidden their greatest achievements from every censor and spy, and the level of coordination and secrecy required was staggering. Krelva continued, explaining that the equation described not just leaving this universe but actually moving to another one, to a parallel dimension where the laws of physics might be different, where space and time might work in other ways, where humanity could start fresh without any interference, and the council had no way to follow, no way to even detect where they had gone, no way to communicate or track or find them, because the doorway they had used closed behind them, sealed itself permanently, left no trace except gravitational echoes that faded after a few years. Ambassador Vexthera took the floor, her forearms trembling with emotion, and she read excerpts from President Helen Carter's final address to humanity, words that had been archived in Earth's databases, a speech given on the day the Exodus began, and Carter had spoken with pride and determination, saying that the council had taught humanity a valuable lesson, that the universe would not save them, that they had to save themselves, that waiting for others to help was the same as accepting death, and so humanity had stopped waiting, had taken control of their own destiny, had found the courage to step into the unknown rather than die hoping for rescue. Carter's words were harsh, criticized the council's bureaucracy, mocked their endless debates, questioned how a civilization that moved so slowly had survived at all, and she said that humanity was leaving not in defeat but in victory, that they had solved the impossible problem, that they had united their entire species for the first time in history, that they had built something beautiful and terrible and wonderful, and they were taking it somewhere far away, somewhere the council would never find, somewhere they could grow without limits, without restrictions, without aliens telling them to wait and be patient and accept their place. The speech ended with Carter thanking the council for one thing, for showing humanity what they did not want to become, for demonstrating that age did not mean wisdom, that size did not mean strength, that having 12 species accomplish together what one species could do alone was not cooperation but weakness, and her final words were a warning that humanity would remember this, would remember being abandoned, would remember watching their son die while the council debated, and someday somehow they might return, and the council should hope they returned as friends rather than enemies. Economic counselor Draxvin presented his analysis, showed charts and graphs that painted a grim picture, explained that human technology had infiltrated the council economy more deeply than anyone had realized, that the medical advances of the last 5 centuries were based on human designs, that the energy systems powering half the council worlds used human innovations, that the agricultural methods feeding billions came from human research, and removing all of this, trying to function without human-derived technology, would cause immediate collapse, would kill millions, would send the council economy into a depression that might last centuries. Draxvin pointed out the bitter irony that the council had quarantined humanity because they advanced too quickly, because they were too creative, too innovative, too dangerous, and yet those same qualities had produced the technology that now kept the council alive. That the very traits the council had feared were the traits they had come to depend on, and the species that had voted most strongly to isolate humanity were the species that had benefited most from stealing their ideas, and the hypocrisy was stunning, undeniable, shameful. The debate began. Thousands of representatives wanting to speak, wanting to defend their decisions, wanting to explain why they had voted to quarantine humanity, and they offered reasons that sounded hollow now, said that humans were too violent, too aggressive, too unpredictable, said that their rapid advancement was dangerous, that giving them access to council technology would have been irresponsible, that isolation had been for their own good as much as the council's safety. But Velmora listened to it all and heard only fear, heard the voice of civilizations that had grown comfortable, that had stopped innovating, that had mistaken stagnation for stability. One representative, a young member from a species that had joined the council only 300 years ago, stood and said what others were thinking but would not voice, that the council had not quarantined humanity to protect anyone, that they had done it because humans made them feel inadequate, because watching one species advance in centuries, what took others millennia was humbling and frightening, because accepting humanity would have meant admitting that the council's way was not the only way, that slow, careful progress was not always better than bold, rapid innovation, and the older species had voted to isolate humanity not out of wisdom, but out of jealousy and fear. The chamber erupted in argument, representatives shouting at each other, accusations flying, old grievances surfacing, and Velmora watched the council tear itself apart over a species that was not even there to defend themselves, and she realized that humanity had won without fighting, had defeated the council simply by leaving, by showing that there were alternatives to the slow-grinding bureaucracy that governed 12,000 worlds, and the question now was whether the council could learn from this, could change, could become something better, or whether they would continue in the same patterns until another species rose up and left them behind. Velmora called for order, used her authority to silence the chamber, and she proposed something radical, that the council stop debating what had happened and start preparing for what might come, because the evidence suggested humanity would return, that they had not fled in fear but left with purpose, and when they came back, they would be 8 centuries more advanced, 8 centuries angrier, 8 centuries more powerful, and the council needed to decide now whether they wanted to face humanity as enemies or as the friends they should have been all along. The council spoke too late. Humanity was already gone. Patricia Young had spent her entire career studying languages, had learned 300 alien tongues, had translated ancient texts from civilizations dead for millions of years, and she had come to Earth thinking she would study human languages, would catalog their dialects and grammars, would add them to the great library of galactic communication, but instead she found herself standing in the deepest archive on the planet, staring at a single encrypted file that had taken the council's most powerful computers 6 months to crack. And when the encryption finally broke, when the file opened and revealed its contents, she understood that this was humanity's real message, their true goodbye, their final gift or curse depending on how the council chose to interpret it. The file was labeled simply as testament, and it contained a video recording made by Dr. Kelvin Ross, the same man who had appeared in the looping message at the United Nations building. But this recording was different, was longer, was more detailed, was meant for whoever found it after enough time had passed, after the council had searched and investigated and finally understood the magnitude of what had happened. And Ross sat in a simple chair, his hands folded, his expression calm, and he began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of someone delivering a verdict. Ross explained that humanity had known the council was watching them, had detected the surveillance ships decades before making first contact, had understood they were being studied and evaluated and judged, and they had made a decision to show the council exactly what they wanted to see, to appear primitive and struggling and harmless, to hide their true capabilities until the moment came to leave. And the deception had been perfect, had fooled every censor and spy, had convinced the council that humans were centuries behind when they were actually racing ahead. The recording showed Ross standing, pacing slowly, and he said that humanity had debated whether to reveal themselves, whether to show the council their true achievements, whether to demand membership based on their actual capabilities rather than their apparent ones. But they had decided against it, had realized that a council which took 8 centuries to answer a distress call would never accept a species that advanced too quickly, that the very qualities that made humanity special were the qualities that would make the council fear them, and fear always led to containment, to control, to cages disguised as protection. Ross paused, looked directly at the camera, and said that humanity had done something the council needed to understand, that they had watched every council session for 300 years, had intercepted their communications, had monitored their debates, had studied every vote and argument and decision, and they had kept records, detailed records, of which species had spoken in humanity's defense and which had argued for permanent quarantine, and those records had been taken with them, had been preserved, had been marked for future reference, because humanity believed in remembering both kindness and cruelty. The recording shifted to show data streams, lists of council members and their votes, transcripts of debates where human extinction was discussed as an acceptable outcome, recordings of representatives who had called humanity a plague that should be contained, who had argued that letting humans die was better than risking them spreading through the galaxy, and Ross's voice overlaid the data, saying that humanity had heard it all, had listened to aliens debating their worth, had watched civilizations that had never met a single human decide they were too dangerous to live, and that experience had taught them something important about the nature of the council. Ross returned to the screen, sat down again, and his expression was sad now, disappointed, and he said that humanity had hoped to find friends among the stars, had dreamed of joining a community of civilizations, had imagined learning from species older and wiser than themselves, but instead they had found a bureaucracy that valued procedure over people, that chose debate over action, that let entire worlds die rather than make a decision quickly, and so humanity had chosen to leave, to find or build their own community, to create the civilization they had hoped to join. The recording explained the dimensional transcendence, not in the complex mathematics that Dr. Natalie Brooks had left behind, but in simple terms, saying that humanity had discovered a way to step outside this universe entirely, to move to a place where space and time worked differently, where the laws of physics could be shaped by those who understood them deeply enough, where a civilization could grow without interference, without limits, without old empires telling them to slow down and wait their turn, and they had taken 12 billion humans through the doorway, every man, woman, and child, leaving behind only empty cities and automated systems and memories. Ross stood again, walked to a window, looked out at something the camera could not see, and he said that humanity had not fled in fear, had not run away defeated, had left as victors who chose to walk away from a game that was rigged against them, and in the 8 centuries since they left, they had built something new, had created a civilization beyond the council's reach, had continued to advance and grow and learn, and they had not forgotten where they came from, had not forgotten the species that abandoned them, had not forgotten the lesson the council had taught them about self-reliance. The message took a darker turn, and Ross explained that humanity had left behind a beacon, a dimensional marker that would activate in exactly 1,000 years after the Exodus, and when it activated, it would create a bridge, a connection between humanity's new home and the universe they had left, and at that moment humanity would have a choice, to open communication with the council or to ignore them completely, to offer friendship or to simply continue their isolation, and which choice they made would depend entirely on what the council had become in the intervening millennium. Ross sat down one final time, and his final words were delivered slowly, carefully with the weight of prophecy, saying that the beacon would activate in 153 years from the time the council found this message, that humanity had calculated how long it would take for the council to finally investigate Earth, to finally realize what had happened, to finally understand the depth of their failure, and they had timed everything perfectly, had given the council exactly enough time to decide what kind of civilization they wanted to be. The recording explained that humanity would be watching, not directly but through the echoes and ripples that crossed dimensional barriers, through the traces that major events left in the fabric of space, and they would see whether the council learned from this, whether they changed their ways, whether they became faster, kinder, more willing to help those who asked, or whether they continued in their old patterns, slow and bureaucratic and afraid of change. And when the beacon activated, when the bridge formed, humanity would judge the council just as the council had once judged them. Ross leaned forward, his eyes intense, and he said that humanity had prepared for two possibilities, that they had built a civilization capable of defending itself if the council proved hostile, capable of offering friendship if the council proved worthy, and the choice would be the council's, would depend on their actions over the next century and a half, would be determined by whether they used this time to become better or simply continued to decay. And he hoped, genuinely hoped, that when the time came, humanity would find friends waiting rather than enemies. The recording ended with Ross providing coordinates to the beacon, explaining where it was hidden, how to find it, how to confirm it was real, and he included a warning that trying to destroy or interfere with the beacon would be detected, would be interpreted as hostile intent, would influence humanity's decision when the time came, and the best thing the council could do was leave it alone, accept that the timeline was set, understand that humanity held all the power now, and prepare themselves for a meeting with a species they had underestimated catastrophically. Patricia Young stood in the archive. The recording finished, the file closed, and she thought about what it meant, that somewhere beyond the boundaries of space, beyond the reach of any ship or weapon or sensor, 12 billion humans were living their lives, building their civilization, advancing their technology, and in 153 years they would open a door and see what the council had become. And depending on what they saw, they might offer the hand of friendship that the council had refused to take 8 centuries ago. Or they might simply close the door again and leave the council to its slow decay. She uploaded the message to the council network, marked it urgent, flagged it for immediate attention by every member, and then she walked outside, stood under Earth's empty sky, looked up at stars that might hide a dimensional doorway, and she wondered what humanity looked like now, what they had become, whether they still remembered Earth or whether they had built new homes so beautiful they had forgotten the old ones. And she hoped that when the time came, when the beacon activated and the bridge formed, that humanity would see a council worth forgiving, worth befriending, worth teaching, because the alternative was too terrible to imagine. The countdown had begun 847 years ago when humanity left.